Hello and welcome back to another tutorial in the Eden editor. Today we're going to be covering triggers. We're going to be covering the purpose of triggers, the trigger fields or basic trigger fields, syncing triggers to units, and then executing triggers and seeing what they do. Firstly, we're going to find where our triggers are. So we go over here to our assets tab, and in F3 or the third section we have triggers. Now there's only 4 different types. They're all the same thing. It's just that these ones come pre-prepared with sizes. So 100 meters, 500 meters, and then a 10 by 10 by 10. For the purpose of now, I'm just going to drag a normal trigger out that hasn't got a size or anything to it. This is just a blank trigger with nothing applied to it. Now a trigger is used to make something happen at a certain time or when something else happens. Something has to be done by the trigger first to allow the other thing to happen. An example of this would be a squad moving when I, the player, get into the trigger zone. So we'll set that up quickly now so that I can show you what I mean by a trigger and you can see it in action. So first we're going to double click on the trigger, or we could right click and go to its attributes, and this is the attribute page for the trigger. So firstly we're going to look at the activation type. What or who can activate the trigger? Some options further depend on activation condition. So we're going to switch this for now to any player, and it defaults to present. So this means that any player that is present within the trigger area is going to set the trigger off, and the trigger will activate. So what we're going to do now is make sure that we have a size for the trigger so that the game knows what zone it is that the player has to go into. So here we can edit the size. We are just going to do a 2 by 2 and then keep that as -1, which means it goes all the way up to the sky. And this means we've got a 2 meter by 2 meter trigger. You can set its shape here. We're going to keep it as an ellipsis for now, but you can put it as a rectangle if you're putting a trigger in a room, for example, and you don't want it poking out the sides of the walls. So now you can see that we've got our trigger goes all the way up to the sky because of the -1, and it is a 2 meter by 2 meter trigger. So we're going to put that in the center of this so that we know as the player where to go. These triggers don't show up in game, they're invisible when you're in the game, they only show up in the editor. So we're going to put ourselves down an ammo bearer, and that's going to be us, and we are going to play as the ammo bearer and walk into the trigger. Now the trigger has activated, but because I haven't told it to do anything after it activates, we don't see anything. If there was something wrong with the trigger activating, we would get an error flag up. What I've done here is placed down a fire team, and like the previous video, we're going to give them a waypoint. What we're going to do is we're going to give them one waypoint, and then we're going to give them another move waypoint. Now what I can tell the trigger to do is I can connect it and set waypoint activation to the first waypoint. What this means is the squad will move to their first waypoint, and then they will not move to their next waypoint until the trigger has been activated by any player being present. Let's jump into the scenario and see if this works. Here we see the squad move to their first waypoint and hold, and when the player moves into the activation zone, the squad moves to their next waypoint. Another thing you can do is make it so that only one certain unit can activate a trigger. To do this, right click on the trigger, connect and set trigger owner. For now we're going to set it to ourselves. That trigger is now owned by us. This means now when we look at this field, the activation has different drop downs. We could do whole group, group leader, any group member, or owner only. This means that we can say the owner being present will set the trigger off, rather than any player. This means that only this player would set off the trigger. If another player crossed through it, it wouldn't do anything. Thank you guys for watching. That was just a basic introduction to triggers and some of their basic functions. I've included this clip at the end just to show you that I've set up a trigger that says only when I'm present should that squad get into the truck. So they stood there until I pulled up into the middle of that X, and then they were told to board the vehicle. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one, where we will talk about creating missions and objectives for players to do in your missions.